Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with the best of Charles Munch, the great Charles Munch. I've been waiting to do this one for ages. Well, not really, but for a while, because I knew from the very beginning that this would be a big deal, because Munch was a fabulous conductor and a fascinating personality. And I think he's the perfect conductor to talk about a certain phenomenon, which I will get to in a moment. Anyway, the 10 best recordings of Charles Munch are on ClassicsToday.com as a special insider subscriber feature. What? You mean you are not an insider subscriber yet? Well, I'm sure you'll want to get right to it. There's a link in the description of this very video. Or you can go to the ClassicsToday.com homepage and sign up there. Do please consider it. We're ripping through lots of conductors doing their best of, and we've got the best of everybody coming up, in addition to thousands and thousands of insider-only reviews with sound clips and all kinds of cool stuff. So do please give it a thought if you haven't yet. Now, what is it about Charles Munch that makes him so interesting? I think he's just the guy to discuss something that you're going to hear about very, very frequently in the classical music world, and that is the difference between studio recordings and live recordings, and conductors who are comfortable in the studio and conductors who are not, and conductors who are supposedly better live than they were in the studio. There's this sort of contrast that we like to make. And it's actually a very interesting one, because the fact of the matter is it's getting worse. The situation is getting worse. Why? Because broadcast archives and radio orchestra archives are opening up all over the world, and everybody recorded everything. It turns out there was virtually nothing that was not recorded. And so we're often more able than ever before to compare the official studio recording to specific live performances. And it's very facile, I think, and very easy for people to say, oh, well, I have this live recording from Tuesday, July 12th at 4 o'clock, 1955, and it's so much more exciting than the studio recording. Well, yes, that is an easy thing to say. But the fact is, it depends on the conductor. It all depends on the artist. Now, you might think that's an obvious thing, and it really is. But in the world of classical music, we are all prone to generalizations. And one of them is that live things are somehow better or more authentic than studio things. I think that that's nonsense, and I think it is for a couple of reasons. Reason number one, conductors, on the whole, artists, professionals, let's just say professionals, they are responsible for doing their best work no matter what the circumstances. Period. No excuses. I do not accept, that conductors who aren't comfortable making recordings do poorer work in the studio than they do live. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. Sometimes the live recordings are more horrible. Sometimes the studio recordings are more horrible. Sometimes they're equally good. And as often as not, the differences are minuscule. They're tiny, tiny matters of inflection and emphasis and spontaneity and things like that matter to some people and not to others. And Charles Munch is the perfect case in point. The reason is because he was fabulous in the studio. He was exciting as hell in the studio, but he was also exciting as hell live. And there is a particular way in which he was different. And that's my second point. Which is this. Conductors will often take risks in live concert of a kind that they would not do in the studio. I'll give you an example that isn't Charles Munch. I'll just give you another example. Yuri Timirkanov. Yuri Timirkanov conducts Rachmaninoff's Second Symphony with unbelievable numbers of cuts all over the place, even cuts that Rachmaninoff didn't make. The finale is 5 minutes long. I'll never forget when I saw it live. It went da-da-da-dum, ba-dum, ba-dum, ba-da-da-dum, ba-dum, ba-dum, ba-da-da-dum, ba-dum, 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 bum, ba-da-dum. That was the finale. All the rest of it was missing. He didn't care, but when he made the recording, This was his RCA recording, his second one, and his first one. He played the work absolutely complete. And you have to ask yourself, was it something that he did intentionally? I mean, was he comfortable doing the whole thing when in concert he only does the suite from Symphony Number 2? Ormandy did the same thing with Rachmaninoff's Second Symphony. It's really an issue. And going back to Charles Munch, here's a guy who could go completely nuts. He was not a let the music speak for itself kind of conductor. He was an interventionist in a lot of ways. And one of the pieces he intervened in was Franck's Le Chasseur Maudit. Now, he made what for many, many, many years was considered the reference recording of Le Chasseur Maudit by Franck. It's a great piece. It's exciting as hell. And his studio recording of it is marvelous, absolutely marvelous. But a while back, back when broadcast recordings and things like that were just sort of popping up and no one was quite sure what the copyright situation was, Music and Arts released this multi-CD set, 2 CDs of Munch doing Franck and Fauré live. You had the Franck D minor, Fauré's Pélias and Mélisande, and the Chasseur Maudit and the Symphonic Variations with Vlado Perlmutter, the Penelope Overture, and the Franck Ballade for piano and orchestra with Nicole Henriot Schweitzer, who he often worked with. Now, these were withdrawn almost as quickly as they were issued because the Boston Symphony got wind of it and told them they had to get rid of it. So it's hard to find this anymore, assuming it exists anywhere at all. But this Chasseur Maudit is really a rip snorter. Now, it has oddities of balance and some imperfections, obviously, in sonics. It's live, and what was the date here? 1959. The studio recording dates from a bit later. It's one of the last recordings he made in Boston, I believe, if not the last. And it's very exciting. And it also diddles the orchestration. It has some extra bass drum rolls at the end. He tinkers. And in the studio recording, he does not tinker. So, is it better because he tinkers? No, it isn't. He just tinkers. I mean, and the irony of it, of course, is that the people who prefer the live recordings say, oh, well, they're uniquely exciting. He does this, he does that. It's special and it's wonderful. Well, it was in the concert. It's on a recording. It's not special anymore because you can duplicate it until the end of time. So the point is not that there's something so unique and special about it. Once it's been recorded, it's fixed. And it's the same thing every time you hear it. So the spontaneity goes out the window, for the most part anyway. And the studio recording is marvelous. And it doesn't have the afflictions of live broadcast recorded sound and whatnot that the live one has. So which is better? I think it's really, of course, it's a matter of taste. Some people prefer the excitement of knowing that it's a live recording and that you hear coughing and people and rustling and even mistakes, even problems. Some people look forward to that, and that's okay. I mean, that's absolutely okay. That's a perfectly legitimate way to prefer your experience of music. But the knowledge that you're listening to a live recording and the knowledge that people are there and stuff is going on, that to me is not a musical quality at all. That has to do with the psychology of the individual listener. And I mean, obviously everyone's entitled to their own psychology, but it's not a musical quality. And it's also wrong to assume that because something was made in the studio that it's somehow unspontaneous or artificial. Another conductor who I think sort of gave light to that whole thing and made a terrible mess of the whole question was Leonard Bernstein. Because in his Deutsche Grammophon recordings, his later Deutsche Grammophon recordings, they were all made from live performances with rehearsals and, excuse me, with rehearsals and patching sessions and other things, mixed in to correct any errors. Yes, that is true. But everything has edits these days. I mean, even live studio, broadcast things often get patched and fixed without anybody telling us. I've seen, if you've been a collector for a long time, how many times have you heard that well, there was a dropout here, so we spliced in a few bars of the studio recording just to make sure everything sounded right. Well, that's what happens. Everything is tinkered. As long as it's a recording, it's an artificial object, as far as I'm concerned. The only valid live anything is when you're sitting there hearing the experience once and never again. The minute it becomes repeatable through technology, it is a recording, and it is subject to all of the rules of a recording. So what happens when you have a conductor like Charles Munch? Yes, there are differences, first of all, between the works he recorded multiple times, like Ravel's Daphnis and Chloe, for example, where the second time he's much more steady in the concluding bacchanal than he was in the first version, or Saint-Saëns' Organ Symphony, where he does some sort of remarkable things in the studio that aren't of the let's do something vulgar and splashy and crazy, but they're rather let's do something more measured and restrained and maybe elegant, maybe tasteful, maybe grand, maybe any of those things. Everything has to be evaluated on its own merits. And the wonderful thing about Charles Munch is that he was just as thrilling as a studio musician as he was live. And I've heard both. I can tell you, and there's a lot of live Munch. I mean, in addition to this stuff, there are radio broadcast. Boston Symphony was broadcast while he was there, and there are boxes of Boston Symphony radio broadcast material, mostly in dreadful sound, but recorded everywhere from Tokyo to Boston itself to in other parts of the world. And so, and there's, of course, his French radio stuff that was on OVDs. And I have it in the box sitting up there. And you hear all the mistakes, because things could go terribly wrong for Munch in concert. It could happen, especially if the orchestra wasn't top notch. It's true of everybody. It's true of absolutely everybody. But the issue is, are we missing anything in the person of Charles Munch by not being able to have access to his live, or as we sometimes call them, historical recordings? My personal opinion is no, because the studio recordings are just so damn thrilling. I can't imagine a live performance that could be more exciting, purely exciting. We're talking about physical excitement, not just a function of speed, a function, of course, of accent and conception and balance and playing and dynamics and all of those things. I mean, he was thrilling in certain repertoire. It didn't matter when he conducted it or where. It made no difference whatsoever. And so I just want to throw this idea out there for discussion, because I really think it's a myth. I think it's a pernicious myth. I think it makes life very, very difficult for collectors, especially you who are starting out, and especially today when it's so hard to find things, to go hunting around for some air check thing when there's a very good studio version that may not be exactly the same in all respects. It's different, but not worse, not less. And I truly do think it's a disservice to these really great artists who really believed that whenever they got up in front of an orchestra, they were going to do their damnedest. They were going to give their best effort. Obviously, some days things go wrong. They go wrong in the studio just as they go wrong live. But the great artists are great. And it didn't make any difference whether they were before the microphones in a controlled environment or whether they were before an audience in a concert hall. Remember, these RCA recordings, which is what we're talking about primarily with Munch, were made in Symphony Hall. I mean, it wasn't like they went into a little recording studio where all 110 of them were packed into a room the size of a bathroom at a train station with a horrible acoustic ceiling and tiles echoing. No, they made these recordings in one of the greatest concert halls in the world, which they would, take out a few rows of chairs and set up the microphones and do it for optimal sonic opulence. And most of Munch's discography certainly qualifies in terms of optimal sonic opulence. And he would go out there, they would do a thrilling job. And his live recordings are not bettered than the ones he did in the studio. So he's one of those artists about whom you really can't say that one or the other is better. You just have to take it on a work-by-work basis. And that's the only point I want to make. Reserve your judgment and consider the artist and what's available to make comparisons. And I think that way we'll be a lot safer. First of all, it keeps us all listening, which is desperately urgent that we do. And second of all, it gives the artists credit for knowing their job. And if they don't know their job, well, that's why I'm here. That's a topic for further discussion. It really is. And don't listen to what the artists themselves say. As often as not, they are the worst judges of their own character, of their own work. And I say that having just presented Leonard Slatkin's own 10 favorite recordings. And again, it depends on the artist. I think he's a very good judge of his own work because he really listens to it. He really, really listened to it. Most artists don't. And when they do, they just like to say, oh, how dissatisfied they are, how bad it all went, how awful everything was. They complain, they gripe, they bitch, they moan. Rare it is. And Leonard Slatkin was one example of the artist who says, you know, we did a damn good job there and I'm proud of it. And I suspect that Charles Munch was very proud of the work he did in Boston. And he should be, because here we are. He left in 1962. And so that's, what is it? It's 60 years later. And these recordings are still classics. And we're still listening to them. And they're still thrilling. And in many ways, many of them have never been bettered. And that says something about the man, about whether he was live or in the studio. It didn't make a bit of difference. So if you have something to contribute on this topic, I would be more than happy to hear it. But I also want to, caution those of you who are collectors who aren't terribly experienced. Do not be gulled by people who tell you that the Holy Grail is lying out there in some live archive somewhere, when there's a perfectly marvelous studio recording available that you can enjoy immediately, easily, without aggravation, inexpensively as often as not. So keep on listening, folks. Thank you so much for joining me. And please become a ClassicsToday.com subscriber and go have a look at Charles Munch's 10 best recordings. I guarantee there are some surprises in there that you might not have thought of. Take care.